Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink, Wednesday, August 9th. And a familiar name to those of you who have read Inside the Hall since the beginning, Eamonn Brennan, one of the original co-founders of the site, now writing buzzer on Substack after writing a longtime college basketball writer for ESPN.com, The Athletic. Eamonn, it's been too long. Welcome back to Podcast on the Brink.
Alex, how we doing?
We're doing well. I wanted to open the show and just ask you about your new endeavor. Obviously, it's never easy to go through a job change, but based on everything that I've read from you on social media and reading kind of your intro post over at your site at eamonnbrennan.com, you're diving headfirst into this opportunity to kind of be an independent creator and forge your own path. What's the transition been like for you, and just what for those maybe interested in checking out your work, what can they expect from you over at Buzzer?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's been a slightly weird time in my life. That's for sure. Did not expect to leave The Athletic at the time that I did. So kind of caught me off guard. I had definitely had the idea of going independent in the back of my head for a while. Obviously, the logistics are a whole nother thing once you get into it. But, it's the kind of thing that I think, listeners to this podcast will understand pretty intuitively. I think that a lot of readers at The Athletic probably understood over time as well, although it's gotten a little woolly as the years have gone by. But sort of the initial pitch of The Athletic and the initial pitch of a lot of independent sites, especially a lot of things that I support every month, like on Patreon, are, hey, kick us a few bucks a month. And if enough people do, we have sort of a small enough but solid enough independent publication that supports one writer, maybe a couple writers' work, and you move on from there. There's no one else that can tell you what to do. You're fully independent. The business winds don't change, and suddenly the content goes away and someone else has to figure out what they're doing for a job. So it's something I'd always been really interested in getting into, and kind of just decided to jump in. Would have had plenty of time to figure out next steps if I wanted to pursue other stuff, and who knows how that'll go long term, whatever. But was very excited to kind of jump into the Substack thing, and it's gone pretty well so far. Like it's for the dead of the college basketball offseason, and for a time when there was really not a ton of stuff to write about, although right when I started was right when Bob Huggins got pulled over for a DUI. I think it was like 2 days later or something. So that was a bit of newsy stuff to get into. But mostly it's been really good, really interesting, still figuring it out as we go, figuring out cadence and what people want to read about. Also, like I said, it's the off season. So the sort of day-to-day college hoops churn that you get starting in November, that's really the fun and the meat of it, is not quite here yet. So ramping up to more nitty-gritty hoop stuff. Been doing a lot of realignment stuff lately. And it's been fun, and it's simple enough. You go to eamonnbrennan.com, you type in your email address, you get the free version. Pretty much everything gets sent to you, but to read all of it, and to participate in Q&As, to do subscriber only chats, you have to kick me a few bucks a month. It's $8 a month, and it is, I would say, worth it. And not only do you get all the stuff, you get to support an independent college basketball writer trying to cover the breadth of this sport in a way that's really thoughtful and fun, and has gotten some really strong and heartwarming support from readers so far.
I know you had a pretty big following at The Athletic for Virginia coverage. How do you, I guess, moving forward, I know you're figuring it all out and how you're going to cover things, I guess, when the season actually starts. I assume you're probably going to still place somewhat of an emphasis on Virginia. Do you expect that to kind of be one of the teams you cover a little bit more frequently? And how do you, I guess, plan to sprinkle in, I guess, the national landscape? I'm sure you're going to be doing things like Bubble Watch and some of the staples that you did normally at The Athletic and ESPN as well.
Yeah, so Bubble Watch for sure. That's the most requested thing. That's kind of a no-brainer. Definitely some form of the power rankings I used to do at the Athletic, which are different from your normal power rankings in that I just kind of rank teams in some vague order of how good they are, but also kind of teams that I really want to talk about that week. people in the early days of the Athletic really liked that idea, and then as the audience grew and comments kind of became a little bit more drive-by, people got mad. But it was very fun for me always, so we'll do that. But the most requested teams probably so far since I've started, from people who have signed up to pay or even just signed up for the free list, is Virginia, followed by Indiana. So those two will feature probably more prominently. It is going to have a national sort of perspective. That's what I've been doing for, since 2000, almost 15 years now, is sort of maybe more than 15 years now, if you count my Yahoo days, as sort of a national college basketball writer, kind of trying to cover the breadth of the sport and big themes in the sport and how realignment impacts it and all of this stuff. But I've also spent a lot of time being out here in the DC area covering Georgetown, Virginia, and then I've spent a little time at the Athletic covering Indiana too. Didn't do a ton of stuff there, but kind of tried to plug the hole for Indiana if and when it was possible, and have spent some time, ruminating in the past at ESPN about Indiana basketball and what it all means. So there'll be some of that too, and I'm particularly interested in digging into this Indiana roster soon here, as we sort of ramp up to more, like I said, nitty gritty college hoops content. And this conference realignment stuff hopefully goes away for a little while. But those will be some main staples, plus the national stuff I've been doing for most of my career. And, we'll see how things evolve. We'll see what people want, what they respond to, what, sort of plans we have for podcasting. During the season, there's going to be some video stuff probably. I think I'll probably do some live video types of things, like reacting to games, particularly big games. So just like I said, really figuring it out as we go. Really excited that the number of people who have signed up have. So far, it's been fun, rewarding, and it's just getting started.
That's awesome. Interesting that you mentioned Indiana being one of the more requested topics. Obviously, you went to Indiana, as I mentioned at the top of the show. You, along with Ryan and I, founded Inside the Hall back in 2007. It's funny that, like, I do a monthly AMA on our community at members.insidethehall.com, and somebody asked if there were other names under consideration when we started the site, and I actually had to go back in the Gmail archives, and I found the original email where me and Ryan were tossing about names. You actually came up with Inside the Hall, but some of the other names that we originally were considering, let's just say that I'm glad those were left on the kind of the back burner, and we didn't use those. But I'm curious, just from your perspective. Obviously, you stopped writing at Inside the Hall in 2009 when you went to ESPN full time, and Ryan and I now have kind of been doing this for 15 plus years, 16 years actually, which is crazy to think. What have just been your impression, just I guess from afar? I mean, I know you still follow the program pretty closely, but maybe not on the day-to-day as like Ryan and I do. Just 16 years later, where Indiana basketball was maybe from when we started Inside the Hall to where it is now. Anything really stand out that happened along the way or surprised you over these last 16 years?
Wow. I guess the saga of Bob Knight finally coming to a close is probably the biggest thing, at least psychologically, right? When I was at ESPN, I got sent out to Bloomington for almost a week ahead of, I think it was in 2016, maybe, ahead of their game against North Carolina. Yeah, it would have been 2016 because it was the 25th anniversary of the 81 team, and it was I'm sure you remember. I was like, oh, is Bob Knight going to show up for this one? Like, they have all these reunions, and Tom Crean was the coach at the time, and Tom was begging him, or had been for a long time, to come back and reunite the family and all this stuff. And there were all these rumors early in the week. Oh, he's going to come, blah, blah, blah. He would never show up. And so I remember going out there doing a big whole story after kind of being in place in case this news happened, and being able to write off of that, instead having it end up being like a sort of, like I said, a rumination on the past of Indiana basketball, the present, how college towns change, how what you remember about them changes. And I think that, for it to be 16 years later at that time from when he was fired or resigned, I don't even remember what the official terminology was on his departure anymore, but that being still ongoing 16 years later and still unresolved sort of speaks to how overriding it was. So I think that a couple years ago now, finally getting kind of put to bed a little bit helps everybody just like be a kind of normal basketball program again, if that makes sense. I don't know how you feel that. I think you probably live it on a more daily basis or did throughout that period. But I think that's probably the biggest thing, because now you just kind of, there doesn't seem to be that weird, like, cloud over the whole program and who are we and what does it all mean anymore. It's just kind of like, yeah, it's Indiana basketball. The glory days are not quite all the way back, but you can just kind of focus on being like a really good program with lots of natural, resources and the ability to win at a high level if everything clicks.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me when I look back on all this time, and I've mentioned this before, like when people have asked me like the biggest thing that Mike Woodson's done since he took the job, is when I just look back at Sampson, Crean, Archie Miller, and now Mike Woodson, it just feels like Mike Woodson is the first of those really four coaches that kind of feels like he's in a position that he belongs in. Because obviously Sampson, when he was hired, great basketball coach, but there were questions about his kind of background and NCAA rules violations, and we saw kind of how that ended up. Crean, for all of his, high marks and accomplishments that he had over his tenure, it never really felt like he was completely comfortable in the job. It was like he was always looking over his shoulder. And Archie Miller, say what you want about him as a coach, and I think he did a lot of great things at Dayton, but I don't think coming into the job he really understood what it meant to be the coach at Indiana from a PR perspective and just all that came with the job. I remember early in his tenure, not long after he was hired, him at a high school game, and he was there watching, and it almost looked like he was uncomfortable with the amount of people that were coming up to him and asking for pictures and autographs and just to talk to him. It felt like he just wanted to be the coach and not do all the other things, which is fine if you're winning, but obviously he didn't win big enough, and those things kind of came under the microscope. With Mike Woodson, he kind of came in from the beginning in his opening press conference and talked about, hey, Scott Dolson wanted to talk to me about the job. I told him to fly here and talk to me. I wasn't going to come there. And, his comment last year, Hoosier Hysteria, talking, he said something like Indiana basketball is the shit and things like that. It's like he just kind of feels like comfortable in his own shoes. I don't know if that's because he's a former player or what maybe he's accomplished over his coaching career, that, he's been there, done that. He's been the coach of the Knicks. So this is not as big a stage as that job was. But, the biggest compliment I can give him so far is just the stability and kind of this level of conducting himself as someone that feels like they belong in the job. Would you agree with any of that? And can you kind of sense that from afar too? It's just like Mike Woodson, maybe he hasn't had the on-court success. Obviously getting to the tournament his first 2 years is a step forward from what, the previous coach did, but I just feel like he belongs in the job.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. I think it's really insightful about Green, particularly because, you sort of look back at his tenure and he hit some heights. They won the Big Ten twice. Obviously, he had that number one seeded team with Cody Zeller and Oladipo. But it was even during that year, wasn't that the year when he, flipped out about the Michigan assistant, Jeff Meyer, like in the handshake line?
After they won the Big Ten outright on Michigan's court. Right.
And so just the sort of talk about looking over your shoulder. It's like, dude, don't worry about it. Like, you're doing fine. Whatever nefarious plots you think were surrounding you at that moment, like, you overcame them, man. You just won. So yeah, I think he had his hands wound so tight on the job that it eventually just slipped through them. Whereas I agree that Mike Woodson has a much lighter touch and feels much more at home. And there's just sort of a calm, relatively quiet confidence to him that maybe, like you said, comes from being in the NBA for so long, where it's like, hey man, not everything is the biggest deal in the world. We'll be fine. Yeah, let's do the next. But I think maybe in his first season, there could have been a little bit more of that, right? Where you needed to have a little bit more urgency at various points of the year, where you had some wins and losses that kind of slipped out of your hands. And in college basketball, you do kind of have to try and win as many games as you can, because the margins for getting in the tournament are really tight. And there aren't that many games in the season anymore, relative to how you need to get in the field. So, but I do think last year was a really good example of this, of just like guys got better over the offseason. He has this, who, with apologies to Cody Zeller, I think the best Indiana big man since Allen Henderson on the floor, and you build everything around him. You get him marginally better, and then you just have like a competent array of guard play, a really, really good freshman, obviously, and some shooters around on the wing. And nothing is, Indiana didn't run the most complex offensive system last year. They aren't reinventing the wheel. They're not doing anything that like is going to super excite basketball nerds, or like, some graduate assistant that's lives in Canada who's inventing some new offense, like in his basement or whatever. There was none of that going on, which is fine. You just have to be competent, run good stuff, put people in good positions, play good ball screen offense, get downhill. And I think that combination of like, let's get guys on campus, let's get them better, and let's put them into relatively straightforward, simple paths to success, I think has been Woodson's biggest thing. And it takes a lot of the drama, all the psychodrama that surrounded Indiana for so long, all of the status anxiety. I think it kind of eases that stuff. And now people can kind of just hang out, watch basketball, and feel relatively secure in the idea that Indiana is going to be pretty good.
You said you were going to spend a little time, I guess, coming up in the next weeks, months, maybe digging into this roster for next season. But I'm just curious to kind of get your high-level thoughts right now in terms of where Indiana stands going into next season. Obviously losing a ton of contributors: Jalen Hood-Schifino, Trace Jackson-Davis, Miller Kopp, Race Thompson, Tamar Bates, Jordan Geronimo. I mean, it's a lot to lose, obviously, but they do bring in talent with Mackenzie Mbako, the former Duke signee, Khalil Ware coming over from Oregon, get Xavier Johnson back. Feels like the pieces are there to put something together in terms of getting back to the tournament next season. Do you agree with that? And just what maybe are you looking forward to most about seeing in terms of the style of play for Indiana next season, and maybe how it differs from last year?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be fascinating to see an Indiana team without Trace Jackson-Davis, for the first time in a long time. And I think there's an obvious, even if you didn't lose the rest of those guys who are significant in their own right, there's just going to be an obvious, step back. You just don't replace a guy that good that easily. It would be like, if Zach Edey just walked out the door in this offseason. Like, Purdue doesn't have anybody who is remotely as impactful as Zach Edey, ready to go right now, So it's just not going to happen. But I think, I really liked what I saw from Malik Renew last year. I thought he was really promising, despite maybe not quite having the physical tools to be a high-level college player just yet. It looks like he's changed that. Obviously, this week he posted on his Twitter like the before and after, high contrast photo of himself having just lifted weights or whatever. And he does, if any of that stuff is remotely accurate, then that's a big deal, because that was the thing that held him back. Like, he's got great feel. His great hands around the rim, could be a little bit better of a defender, but I really like his game. And so just being able to play at the physical level required in the Big Ten is going to be his biggest challenge. And if he can get there, then Indiana has a really good shot, because Mbako is going to be young, looks really good, young, right? And it's not one-to-one coming in just like you're going to succeed automatically. It takes a little while. I mean, it takes a while for everybody. So right. I think the pieces are there to be really interesting. I think they should make the tournament. I think the backcourt is a little scary, because if you lose Xavier Johnson, then it's kind of like, what's the depth situation look like? Whereas last year, you know, you got a lot of guys, including a 5-star lottery pick who can pick up the slack. And I think Trey Galloway has a chance to be like a really good attacking on ball point guard type of player if he can just shoot like, 31% from three or something. You know what I mean? If he can just get that number to where it's like you have to consistently respect his outside shot, I really like that player. So yeah, there's some depth issues in the backcourt that might be a little worrying, but there's talent. There's still talent here, and I think they're not going to, asking this team to be as good or as savvy or as tough as they were last year is a big thing to ask. But I think in terms of keeping pieces around and having something to work with as a coach, like he's done pretty well.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what the expectation needs to be going forward, is just get in the tournament every year. Eventually you keep doing that and you break through and you get to a Sweet 16 and Elite Eight, a Final Four. I mean, was kind of the thing with Crean. He'd have those Big Ten title years and then he would come back the next year and not make the tournament. I think Indiana fans for the most part are going to be happy with a coach that can get them to the tournament every year. So Woodson doing it in his first 2 years, I think is a good way to start. If he does it for a third straight year, I think that's a really good way to begin the tenure in Bloomington, particularly after Archie Miller, not really being able to get there at all. Obviously, right. The COVID year, he probably would have made it, but I think that was obviously his undoing, was just not even being able to get to the tournament. And I think that Indiana fans want that to be kind of the baseline expectation. It hasn't been that way for a long time, but I think, like I said, Woodson being able to do that 3 straight would go a long way in kind of setting that expectation moving forward.
Yeah, well, and you build momentum that way too. So like, the next Khalil Ware, when he's thinking about where he wants to transfer, it's not just an NIL decision. It's not just a minutes decision or an exposure decision. It's also, am I going to play in the tournament? And what are the odds of me playing in the tournament? It's like a soccer player in Europe deciding between 2 clubs and one is going to play in the Champions League and one isn't. Like that, the former is more attractive. So if you're consistently in the NCAA tournament, and that's the baseline expectation for your program, and you're not asking guys every year, every 2 or 3 years to come help you build, like you're going to be on the ground floor of it again. Let's rebuild this thing. You create year over year momentum. And I think that's easier to do than ever now, right? Like you can, if you're Indiana, lose everybody that you lost last year, bring a couple, 3, 4 key pieces, decent pieces back. And I think Xavier Johnson qualify and Renew qualify as key pieces, Galloway, Maso Menos. But like you then go out and you get a guy that Duke recruited, like a top 10 player that Duke recruited, and who brought a guy back over the top of him, who's available in whatever month he signed up. What was it? May.
Yeah, May.
And so you do that, and then you get this guy out of Oregon who's super talented, who just didn't click there for whatever reason, didn't work. However, he's available on the transfer market. You go get him, and all of a sudden you look at it, you're like, there's some serious talent at this program, despite losing all those guys last year. It's easier to do that now than ever in Indiana, with its resources, with its facilities, with its basketball culture. Should be able to do that basically every year to at least get a group of guys on campus that in theory you go into October, November thinking this team can make the tournament. Everybody stays healthy, whatever the things on the margins might be. You go in thinking this is a tournament team, and then some, hopefully a single digit seed. Anything else, great. And eventually you keep doing that and you get back into, you're a single digit seed regularly, and you are a program that can expect to be there, trying to push deep in the field every single year.
Last topic I wanted to talk to you about, and it may take a little bit of time to dive into this, but conference realignment obviously is the story right now in college sports, and obviously is a website that covers Indiana basketball, and admitting, I guess the first thing kind of you look at with all this conference realignment, we all know it's football driven. So it's been interesting, I think, to watch from afar. I know you've written about it. I'm just kind of curious how how you think long term this changes college basketball, if at all. I mean, obviously, if this is all centered around football and TV money, but um, basketball is a sport that is obviously key to just in the general college sports landscape. It's a revenue sport, but I don't know how much of that is even being looked at when any of these decisions are made. To me, it's purely football. Would you agree with that? And just, I guess, how concerned are you generally with the health of the sport as we kind of lose maybe some of the kind of the regional aspect of college basketball? And I can't say that I'm too excited about watching Rutgers and Washington play a Big Ten game in a couple of years, but obviously that's kind of where we're going. Do you think there's an argument that college football should break away and kind of leave these other sports to kind of do their own thing? I mean, I'm just kind of curious for your big picture thoughts on all of this and how college basketball kind of fits into this whole puzzle.
Yeah, I mean, where to start? So I think honestly, the best thing I've seen about this recently is what Chip Kelly said in the last couple of days, basically saying like every major college football program should just become Notre Dame and play independently, and the other programs at the school can be in the conferences that they should be in, because it's not a big deal for once a week, 12 games a season football teams to travel. They,
right.
It's not a big deal for UCLA to travel to Rutgers because they get there on Thursday and they're home on Sunday, and that's not a huge issue. But basketball players are traveling on, in the middle of the night on Tuesday, flying 6 hours back from New Jersey to Westwood. Like, it's insane. And that's a revenue sport. That doesn't even go into like the Olympic sports and the cross country flights and coach that they take. So I think that's probably the best idea I've heard. I don't think it's going to happen. And I think you get to the point, where, I think the culture of college sports is, and I've written this a couple times now, but like the culture of college sports is what makes it good. And part of that culture is local rivalries and weird traditions and stuff like the Apple Cup, where Washington plays Washington State. And I'm growing up in Iowa in, 2001 playing NCAA football 01 thinking, oh, the Apple Cup's cool, even though I have no idea really what it means or what it stands for. I don't know anybody from Washington State, but you just have these things that people get into because they're built around rivalry and quirk. And you just don't have that when you sort of pave over all this stuff and just make it, a 20-team league with teams from all over the country who have, zero local history, zero rivalry stakes. You basically have now broken up 100-year-old league that made pretty consistent geographic sense for most of the time and was culturally a very sort of tight-knit league in a lot of ways, probably to its detriment ultimately in the Pac-12, where, there was an air of sort of academic and cultural superiority about the Pac-12 that I think ultimately led to its demise, or helped to lead to its demise in any case, help them not get to the point where they were more attractive to TV partners. But I think basketball is always a second order concern. It's pretty frustrating. I understand why it happens. I think the Big East is the thing that's really heartened me in recent years. The fact that the Big East is A, so good at basketball, and B, doesn't need football to do that is really encouraging for the future of like college basketball as a whole. If you can maintain these rivalries, keep teams tight knit, really build around a culture, which is one thing you'd say for the Big East. It has culture. You know what I mean? It's a lot of Catholic schools, a lot of Eastern schools. They all kind of hate each other. When the fans go see each other at the Big East tournament, they swear at each other in similar accents. You know what I mean? Like they have a culture there. And the Big Ten had that. And I think to a certain extent still will, but it gets diluted when you start adding teams like Oregon and Washington and
USC, UCLA. I mean,
these are West Coast people who, are going to be coming to the Big Ten tournament and finding things to be probably a little weird.
Well, the Big Ten
It's,
tournament will probably just be relocated to Vegas. So
I mean, that's the thing. I saw someone tweeting that about the Big 12 basketball tournament going from Kansas City to Vegas. And it's like, that would be the most college sports thing of all time in 2023 is like, let's take this authentic, beloved local event away from Kansas City and put it in a place where half the people going into T-Mobile Arena won't even know what's happening that night.
right, yeah.
So
I gotta ask you that.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. I just want to ask you, and this is something I've thought about actually ever since all the realignment stuff really got underway with the SEC obviously picking up the schools that they have and UCLA and USC going to the Big Ten. I've thought more and more about this, and I'm just curious to get your take. Indiana, their place in the pecking order in the Big Ten from a football perspective is at the bottom, or if not at the absolute bottom, close to it. And I just wonder long term, if they're going to always have a seat at the table in the Big Ten, because, the bigger these leagues get, does it get to the point where they start looking at, hey, who's our weakest link? Who can we, who's not bringing the same things to the table? I mean, do you think that's ever a possibility that teams start getting, an Illinois or an Indiana or a school like that really isn't maybe, I guess, quote unquote, pulling their weight from a football perspective? Do you see that as something that could ever happen in terms of those schools getting replaced? And with that said, I mean, to me, that kind of, from an IU perspective, makes it a little bit more important, if it is a possibility, to kind of get things, I don't want to say moving in the right direction, but at least become more competitive in football.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, that would be a frightening thing to me if I was or if I was an athletics administrator at some of these schools. If, we've already basically seen in the last weeks, months, years that these conferences and these schools will chase what TV executives, if a TV executive comes to Big Ten and says, hey, if you were to add UCLA and USC, your next rights deal would be significantly improved. And they're like, okay, let's do it. It's just like not a thought. It's like, it is, right. Yes, let's do that. It's not like, is this good for the league? Is this good for the culture? Is this what we stand for? I think when you're operating at the size of leagues like the Big Ten and the SEC, some of that is understandable. They are trying to be like the mini NFL. But the upshot of that is that other parts of what make college sports great get left behind. And the idea of Indiana one day not being in the Big Ten, as crazy as it might sound to us right now, is not all that far-fetched. The idea of UCLA being in the Big Ten is probably more far-fetched. Right. And it happened. So, yeah, I think that's concerning. I think the money that ESPN that Indiana, gets from the Big Ten network, and the Big Ten sort of increased largesse, has been a real boon. I mean, I remember when I was a student there writing a column, like your standard kind of know-it-all college kid about like, why don't we have the student section like Michigan State's? Why aren't more of the students on the floor? Why do we have all these fusty old boosters sitting in the best seats in the house? And, an administrator taking me to lunch at Yogi's and being like, look, man, they pay money and students don't. And, those people have been sitting in those seats for 50 years and they pay a lot of money to maintain them every year. And this is how much Michigan makes on a college football Saturday. That's how much we make for an entire basketball season. And in Indiana at the time, the football team was especially poorly attended. I think it's improved a lot since then. But so Indiana being able to compete to get money like that in from the Big Ten network, despite not having to be that good at football, has been huge, obviously. And if that were to ever go away, or another possibility is the Big Ten comes back to Indiana and says, hey, look, Ohio State makes us a ton of money. Y'all don't make us all that much. So what we're going to start doing is tiering out are distributions from the TV rights every year. And Ohio State's going to get more and you guys are going to get less because that's what the numbers tell us.
That's kind of how the real world works too, right? I mean,
yeah, it is. And I think there would be a huge uproar among most of the, I mean, that's basically what caused the issues in the Big 12 with Texas, right? Is, Texas expected to be paid like the athletics program that it is in terms of revenue generation from TV rights. And the rest of the Big 12 was like, Kansas and Oklahoma State and everybody else is sitting there like, hey, man, no, we're all in this together. It's not quite that simple, but that's basically a big part of what happened. And, now Texas is in the SEC. So I think that model, it has to persist. And if it doesn't, then at that point, Indiana, maybe, 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the road might be in some trouble. But for now, I think, the Big Ten is going to make more money. Indiana's going to make more money. That's all well and good. I think the big concern for me now is sort of steamrolling over these college sports traditions. Even a tradition as big and sort of broad and general as the Pac-12, to me, doesn't bode well for where college sports are going, for fans, for athletes, for coaches, for what it all means, for the stuff that we grew up loving and what was interesting about it and what separates it from professional sports. That stuff is kind of maybe slowly going away.
Yeah, and I think you add in the fact that of NIL and the whole idea of pay for play, and there's going to be some segment of fans just kind of, they get fatigued from all these changes, right? And they're going to check out, and that's another thing that worries me a little bit. But obviously things change, times change, and everything. For the most part, I think NIL has been a positive step forward,
totally,
in many ways. But there are going to be certain people that are turned off by all this, and I think it's a challenge just in general. But Eamonn, we could keep you for a long time and talk more, but obviously you've been more than generous with your time, and we really appreciate you coming back on the show. I have to get you on once the actual season starts and the Hoosiers have some games under their belts, and see how things are going with the team. But I really appreciate you carving out some time on a Wednesday afternoon for us.
Yeah, it's not a problem at all. I really enjoyed it and would be happy to do it anytime. And once again, would encourage folks to check out the Substack. It's eamonnbrennan.com. It's called Buzzer by Eamonn Brennan, and would really appreciate everybody giving it a look. Sign it up for free. If you don't want to pay for it right away, that's totally cool too, but come check us out.
Absolutely. Thanks everybody for listening to this week's episode of Podcast on the Brink. It really would help us out if you could take the time to leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, leave us a rating on Spotify, help more people find the show, and just kind of helps us grow our audience. So keep that in mind and take a couple seconds of your time to do that. We'll be back soon, hopefully next week, with another episode of Podcast on the Brink. Excuse me. Thanks everybody for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.